Somebody who was influential for me on this topic, and probably for many of you and many listeners as well, is David Graeber, who speaks with such moral clarity on that issue of debt in all of his work, but particularly in his book Debt. And it had always had a feeling that something sort of unjust was taking place in the system, but he really helps give you the language and the historical context behind that idea that you're unpacking there. Just like, why is it not always a moral thing to pay your debts, or why is that the societal expectation? And I think my thinking, I know, has changed in that regards, because for me as a young person, and probably for all people as young people, but especially in the 90s and early 2000s, the expectation just was go to college. It's relatively cheap. We're in this golden age, and you're going to be able to pay back those debts. Not a problem at all. Well, then folks like myself and my wife, we all went to college. We got degrees. They crashed the whole financial system, through no fault of our own, and suddenly couldn't get the jobs that were promised to us. A whole generation of folks in that cohort and beyond, right? And so then we saw the stagnation of wages, and meanwhile we saw the cost of everything else go up too. So housing has been, largely unaffordable for a generation. The cost of healthcare has increased. So we haven't been able to pay down that debt because it feels like the rug was pulled out from under us, while we may well be examples of having done everything right. Right. Going to school, getting married, settling down, having kids, and every step of the way just comes with higher costs, and you can never seem to get out from underneath it. I think the reason that is such a powerful idea is because it really flips the script away from, whose debt is it anyway? Part of loaning an 18-year-old that debt in the first place is to say, well, you're taking some risk on that. So maybe the incentive should be to keep the economic system in place in the first place, so that way they'll have good jobs and they'll have high wages and they'll be able to pay those things off. Because I think for a lot of people in my cohort as well, and it could possibly include you three, but I've more than paid off my debt. I've paid back that original principal, times over, but just due to the fact that interest and economic circumstances have really prevented a dent in that original principal. I've been paying interest and essentially profit to the federal government for several years now. So yeah, it is a really interesting conversation. I think if you begin to rethink what the function of debt is and how that can actually be democratically, reconfigured or reimagined, instead of just having the imposition of this notion of debt come to us from the people who, ruined the economy in the first place.
Exactly what you're saying, Nick. We know that the notion that some debts are mandatory and have to be paid is this kind of moral force. But we also know that there's plenty of debts that get canceled all the time. President Trump had how many bankruptcies that just got all of his debts just got written off. The corporate debt that's just ballooned since, especially since COVID, but even prior to COVID, and that has been kind of just written off time and time again. The 2008 financial crisis was a whole, a debt forgiveness program, but for the wealthy and for the banks, not for the working people. I think that's an important thing to draw out here, is that we do have some kind of moral vocabulary for debt being forgiven. It's just, whose debt are we willing to forgive and under what circumstances?
I wanted to add something really quick to this narrative because Nick, you brought up a really important point, kind of like the education myth, like you got to go to school, you got to get a degree, so on and so forth. I think it's really important to note that the people that pushed that myth were boomers that went to school when it was either free or you could work a summer job and pay for it. And I just want to make one really quick historical point that I think is really vital to this conversation that Thomas reminded me of as well. Public universities across the country, in many cases, were free, and or you paid just fees up until like the late 70s. So you had the University of California system, which guaranteed a free public higher education. You had the CUNY system in New York. That is taken away, and I think this is really important. It's not a natural economic development. This is a political decision to jack up prices and cut funding for higher education at the state and federal level. And then one of the reasons that's done is because in the 1960s, you have a lot of different quote unquote radical movements happening on college campuses, mainly led by people that had historically been marginalized, i.e. Black, Hispanic, BIPOC, so on and so forth, women. They're on campuses and they're saying society and the university's got to change. They push for those changes. And then you get a pushback from the right. A trilateral commission report comes out that Ronald Reagan reads religiously and follows, with that says there's too much democracy on campuses. The students don't respect authority. Okay, Reagan and his friends say, how do you get them to quote unquote respect authority, and how do you tamper down these revolts? They come up with a good plan: drive tuition and put people in debt, because debt then becomes a disciplining apparatus. And so these debts that are owed by generations post boomer are the direct result of political decisions to tamper down democracy, to create this hierarchical relationship of authority, so on and so forth, to continuously try to marginalize people that have been marginalized throughout the history of this country. So I think it's really important to keep the historical context in mind when thinking about like who owes who what. Are these debts legitimate or illegitimate, so on and so forth. And always remember, universities were free in this country. They can be free again. They're free in other countries. I used to live in Brazil for 10 years. You go to grad school in Brazil, the government in a public university, they will pay you to study. So there's just all sorts of different examples that we can use to say it doesn't have to be this way.